is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
A new push to pull out of the France-backed CFA currency is gathering momentum in West and Central Africa. Benin's President Patrice Talon started it all when he announced that 8 West African countries would be taking the initiative to withdraw their foreign exchange reserves stashed at the Bank of France in Paris. However, the move is only a recurrent and often controversial issue around the pegging of the African nations' currencies to the currency of former colonial power France and other European countries. So is the CFA a force for currency stability in Francophone Africa, or a tool of economic exploitation? And how is it that the CFA system has been in place for so many years? And what would be the implications of African countries backing out of this arrangement? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, let's dig deeper into the debate on the CFA and France. We are now joined by an expert panel of guests to probe the franc CFA's influence in Africa and the new push by West African countries to break away from the Bank of France. In Paris, Professor Geoff Toka, he's an expert on foreign policy formulation. He's also a professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. In the Portuguese capital of Lisbon is Paul Melly, a consulting fellow for the Africa program at Chatham House. And with me in studio here in Nairobi is Hans de Marie Hengup. He's a senior analyst for Central Africa at the International Crisis Group. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on the program today. Paul Melly, I'll start off with you because I want to take a step back and go to the origins of the franc and the CFA, because since 1945, though, the West and Central African CFA has been pegged to the French francs and later the euro, with its reserves being kept in France. Break it down for us, though. How is it that 50 years or thereabouts after independence, the structure is still in place for that long?
Well, the structure is in place because although now there's political pressure growing for change, the CFA does actually bring certain economic advantages for the West and Central African countries. It keeps inflation at a very low level, it maintains monetary stability, and that's particularly important for the West African countries, some of which are among the poorest countries in the world. So it would be a big challenge, or it would have been in the past, for them to have their own national currencies resisting the economic pressures of the global exchange market, if you like. And so it's given them a basis of economic stability, and it's helped to attract investment in the past, because investors knew if they were investing in a domestic economic sector, for example, electricity or telecoms or something like that, their revenues would effectively be in hard currency. But over the recent years, there's been a problem that's cropped up, which is that it's really been a case of giving the elites in these countries those advantages of having a hard currency, while gradually putting pressure on the competitiveness of these economies, because compared with other West African countries, right, and this is particularly true in West Africa where countries are producing cocoa and cotton and so on, it's been hard to keep up with the pressure from Ghana, for example. So,
Hans, you're listening to this, and of course you're from one of those countries that uses the CFA. Paul mentions that it would be a challenge for these countries without it being pegged to the franc. First, do you agree with that?
It's true that first there's a need to address that issue in a very non-passionate way, because as it falls in the France and Africa relations, many people do not tend to focus on the key and objective indicators. Yes, CFA franc does have some advantages, including the macroeconomic stability. But beyond that, it does also have huge advantages from the economic point of view, but also politically. One of the key disadvantages of the CFA francs, economically speaking, is those economies are less agile in terms of possibility of being innovative in the macroeconomic planification. they have to respect strict conditions, and the same criticism that we can see when we observe the Eurozone in France, we can also see the same in the CFA France zones. The fact that launch the economic projects and things like that is very blocked because you have to put 50% of your currencies, foreign currencies, in the French treasuries. And politically, of course, is much more serious. Why? Because there is the question of sovereignty that is playing also, and that should not be undermined or minimized by people who are discussing about it. And there is also the need for Francophone Africa, and particularly certain countries, if I take the case of Cameroon, to have a kind of harmonized currency with some of the key commercial partners. Cameroon is at the border with Nigeria. They share 1,700 kilometers together, and is one of the key economic partners of Cameroon. Should Cameroon be more advantaged in being in the CFA zone with other countries that do not have sustained and very deep economic exchanges with it, or should it be more advantage to be in a kind of currency that could enhance the country to have access to Nigerian market?
Let's explore the sovereignty part a bit, because you have talked about the political connection and the political sovereignty that is also being discussed at the moment. What are the circumstances, though, that kept this country within the CFA franc, though? I mean, were they compelled to retain the monetary system? What was the political reasoning at independence to retain the CFA franc?
No, the fact is that I'm not sure that at the very beginning of the independence, all the different African countries were the capacity, economically speaking, to have each of them their own currency. And even those who have adopted the currency at that time, we have seen that they were printed those currencies in other countries than them, because perhaps they did not have the technology and all the logistic going along with that. So that's the first thing. But right now, we are 60 years later. There's a problem of how some African leaders or dictators or authoritarian government try to appear in a positive way vis-à-vis the French government by supporting, for example, CFA France, in order to have a kind of backing or support of French government when it comes to UN Security Council, who would like to sanction them, for example, for human rights violation and things like that. We have seen many African countries, head of state in Francophone Africa, taking this kind of very strange diplomacy, where they will accept to remain within the CFA France as a guarantee that they could bargain with France in order to avoid the kind of political pressure of France through democratic reforms, respect of human rights and things like that.
All right, I want to explore that a little bit more. Professor Toka, there is an issue of the political lineage here as well, but the president of Benin, Patrice Talon, recently said in agreeing to end the model, he said the current model is more of a psychological problem than a technical one. Contextualize the circumstances leading to this fresh drive for us against the background of what Hans has mentioned.
Yes, it seems that there are the psychological dimensions of this issue, however passionate it is, and it is, I know, highly passionate in Africa. It seems that the psychological dimensions actually overcome the pure economically, objectively analyzed parameters here. Certainly from French point of view, but I would assume from as it comes to most African countries. Don't forget that we are in the context of 1945 when all that was installed. I mean, the international scene and the type of relations between the recently decolonized countries, or those to become decolonized over coming 2 decades, was so different from 2020 situations. So that goes without saying. Now, having said that, from a French point of view, we're speaking even more so about psychological, or let's say prestige or soft power type reasons, which make it interesting for France to keep this structure, or indeed would make France generous, quote unquote, and letting African countries actually have a full or greater sovereignty over their currency, and being able to have the leverage of monetary policies in order to do whatever they consider to be the best for their economies.
Right. So, Professor, what is the sentiment, though, in France? What is the thinking, though? Are there sort of like strained relations between France and its former colonies? Or what is the thinking leading to this new drive from Africa?
You know, there is a long tradition, and not a very glorious one, in France regarding the overall set of relations between Paris, the métropole, and the ancient colonies. Now, the formal discourse we've been hearing for decades now is that how important it is that there would be some kind, there would be more independent leverages in the hands of African leaders on one hand. On the other hand, a long list of values and ambitions and objectives that French leaders took the liberty to preach over, mainly in terms of democratization, in terms of fighting corruption and things like that. And parallel to that, we've been hearing for at least 30, if not more years in Paris, voices calling upon the end of what the French called the France-Afrique, namely those special relations between France and the ex-colonies, in the sense of not very Catholic, excuse me for the term, relations involving corruptions, involving parallel circuits, and things like that. So we've been hearing that from the mouth of the new administration in France. As you know, President Macron acceded power about 2.5 years ago. His Minister of Finance just repeated a month ago, 2 months ago, that France would play it a fair game, and actually France would appreciate if the African countries would take the decisions themselves, and France would be helpful in that, once again calling upon the end of the France-Afrique tradition. Is this just a formal discourse which would stay contained in the limits of rhetorics?
Right.
Or would it be practically supported by French concrete deeds? Trust to see.
Right. Paul, looking back at that, calling for the end of this France-Africa sentiment, though, one would be deemed to ask, was Francophone African independence real then? Or was this just a continuation of the French policy of assimilation?
No, I think independence would be real, and I think it's really important, as both the other speakers have said, to take account of how the world has changed over the recent decades. Because the system that worked reasonably well back in the 60s, 70s, early 80s in providing stability probably has now reached its limit, its usefulness, particularly in West Africa, where the economies are mostly growing at a steady pace. They're mostly now fairly stable. They're increasingly integrated with their English or Portuguese-speaking neighbors in the region. And there's growing domestic political pressure within those countries for an end to this monetary relationship. The pressure is really political. The debate in West Africa isn't so much about economic advantages as to whether the CFA franc is still competitive or not, or whether it controls inflation or not. The pressure is really a feeling that independent African countries shouldn't need to place their foreign currency reserves in France. And you've got to change, of course, as the professor just mentioned, in French politics as well. You have a new generation. The current head of state in France, when he was a trainee civil servant and had the opportunity to go abroad on a 6-month assignment, he chose to go to Nigeria rather than one of the traditional French partners in Africa. So he himself has a different take, if you like, a different understanding of Africa from that of the traditional France-Afrique circles.
Right.
So there's a moment of opportunity now, and France has signaled that it's ready for change. So in a way, the challenge now is to the elites, to the decision makers in the countries that use the CFA franc. Are they willing to take this step? And it seems that in West Africa, they are now prepared to do so.
Right. Professor Toke, let's get your view, though, because in terms of how this relationship has benefited either side, because currently the CFA member countries receive about 0.75% interest on their deposits, while France collects, billions of US dollars out of this. Now, this sounds rather exploitative. How is this arrangement seen in France? Is it sort of like a situation where it is perpetuating a culture of dependency, though?
It certainly does. It certainly has in the past. I would say that the objective advantages from the French point of view have ceased in their significance over the decades, right? But it is still something which, if you look at the world scene, which would be exceptional. And this is why the overall interpretation of what the current present French administration position over this issue has been interpreted is that actually throwing it over to the African scene and saying, well, it's your decision, go ahead. We're just here. We were here in order to secure, way back in the past, we, the French, we were here in order to give some further, more secured overall parameters to your system. Indeed, it worked this way, and it had given security and stability. It was attractive in terms of foreign investment into those West African countries. And don't forget that the French, in this sense, have the double experience of, on one hand, having exercised this kind of, if you wish, neo-colonialism, harsher or slighter, and on the other hand, going through this very enriching experience of getting into the euro, into the common European currency, with all the insights which have been done now over about 20 years now, which I'm sure would be a very relevant insights to African countries as they are taking their decisions whenever they're going to take it.
Right.
So the French are actually exposing some kind of position in which actually the ball is in African hands. Let the ball be decided upon in Africa.
Well, Professor, France was there to support the system, in your words, though, but what did France gain from it?
The fact that there were interest on the deposits of West African countries in the central bank in Paris. For some part of it, at least, it was not totally. And then I would say beyond purely economic factors, the fact in terms of prestige, in terms of reaffirming in a very concrete way the role of France, the international significance of French role in Central and West Africa, well beyond the moment in which the French flag was removed from the in African countries. So that kind of accompanying of the fact that France is not anymore the colonial power, of course, but still exercises that much influence and to some extent economic leverage over a large number of African countries. That's an element in the world overall international geostrategic scenery.
Right, Hans, I'll get your comment on that in just a moment, but gentlemen, do stay put. That's only our first part of this ongoing debate on the controversy around the France-backed CFA currency in Africa. Now, shortly, we'll look at the process of breaking away and the implications this will have on the continent and beyond. Don't go away. We'll be right back after the short break.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, our expert panel is on standby. Professor Geoff Tokar in Paris, an expert on foreign policy formulation. Paul Melly in Lisbon, a consulting fellow for the Africa program at Chatham House. And in studio, Hans de Marie Hengop, a senior analyst for Central Africa at the International Crisis Group. First, Hans, your reaction to Professor Tokar's sentiment earlier.
I do share Professor Tokar's views that France's interest is most of prestige, enhancing his international position as a global power. When you study the long history of France and Francophone Africa relationship, even in one we can call French geopolitical doctrine, you will see that Francophone Africa has always played a key role in enhancing the French international prestige, the fact that France appears as a global power, a power which is above its real economic and military weight. So this is very important. But I would like to come back on the issue of independence by saying, for sure, Francophone African countries are independent, but definitely there is still a kind of structural dependency with France. If I take the case only on the currency that we are talking about, there are some macroeconomic policies within the CFA zone that could not be taken without a kind of approval or participation of the French Ministry of Economy or Finance. And when you see, for example, the top level meetings of the CFA France zone that was held, for example, last year, if I remember, in Yaoundé, if I take specifically the case of CEMAC area, you will see that IMF was there, but also the French Ministry of Economy at that time. So that's a signal that even in the board of administration of those different economic sub-regional organizations, they are French that have position within. So I do not want to amplify or overrate the impact of France among all those things, but for me it's not just, it's a prestige, is enhancing the international position, but there is also a concrete dependency, at least when it comes to implementing macroeconomic policy.
Right, but on the African side though, what have they gained?
On the African side, people put in front different economic advantages, as I was saying, for example, that the inflation rate within the France CFA zone is lower than in the inflation rate in Africa. People will say, for example, that economically it's cheaper to have all the CFA francs printed in Paris rather than in different countries of the 14 countries of the CFA franc zone. So there are those kind of things that they put in front. They also say that it has helped facilitated exchange between the countries because it's the same currency. But the problems there in terms of geoeconomy is that the key countries within this West Africa area are actually Anglo-Saxon countries. For example, the first economy in the area is Nigeria. So if you could do exportation with Chad, with Central African Republic, whose GDP are very, very low. And you cannot do it with Nigeria, which is $350 billion GDP, is clearly a problem and is one of the problems that some of the countries are facing. And more generally, people just put the reality in face that what could explain that despite all those macroeconomic advantages, Francophone African countries in terms of growing rate are not going as fast as some Anglophone African countries.
We do understand that the central banks of these African countries that want to move away from the CFA franc, they have an alternative and they are going to be expected to manage all their foreign currency reserves and distribute them to the various banks. Help us to understand, though, that how this is going to work. What is that alternative looking like?
Well, the alternative, quite a lot of the plan has already been worked out by the president of Côte d'Ivoire, Alassane Ouattara, who before he went into politics was number 3 in the IMF. So it's quite helpful that among the national leaders there's someone with a very strong grasp of these issues. But still there are going to be really difficult political decisions. And as Hans mentioned, we have the challenge that the biggest economy in West Africa is actually Nigeria, which has its own central bank and its own currency. So working out how we move from the first stage of the ECHO to a regional currency that all of West Africa signs up to, that's still to be, the practical issues around that have still to be resolved.
Right, so we're going to wind up in a minute, but I do want to get some sentiments from you. Hans, starting off with you though. So we're now seeing these 8 countries spearheading the movement to withdraw from the CFA. So what are the possible economic and political implications of this withdrawal?
Well, economically speaking, some people fear that there could be a kind of increase of inflation, for example, or that there will be a devaluation of the new currency that they will adopt, because the new currency will not have all the security of the French treasury, because the French treasury that guarantee the convertibility with euro currency. So these are some of the fear that people have. But I think it's perhaps because people have not used a kind of very gradual approach. If they had decided to withdraw from the CFA front, for example, in a very gradual approach, like, for example, changing the name as first, deciding that it will be printed now in another country, and thereafter, for example, reducing the deposit in the French treasury instead of 50%, perhaps 25%, and gradually withdraw in that way, they will felt less the possible macroeconomic instability due to a kind of sudden withdrawal.
Right. Paul, your sentiments on that, the possible economic and political implications of this withdrawal?
Well, I think that the proposal put forward by President Ouattara is quite shrewd, because it exactly picks up the issues that Hans has just raised. By changing the name next year to the ECO, that will reduce some of the immediate political pressure and demands for monetary independence, because for many people in their everyday lives, there will be a new banknote and a new name. It'll look different. But that will also provide time for a phased transition of the real practical arrangements, reducing the reserves in the French treasury, eventually moving to a currency basket. As it were, it'll separate the political issue from the technical economic ones, which may need a much more gradualist treatment, as Hans has outlined.
Right. Professor Toka, particularly from the French perspective.
I would say that it goes for the French perspective, but it goes beyond it. I mean, I would say that the provisions regarding how well will that run down history and economy depends to a large extent to the Nigerian role. Nigerian economy represents around 73%, I think, of the overall economies of the 15 potential members for this new ECO. So the type of relations and the type of practices between Nigeria and the 14 others would be detrimental to the success, let it be at the very beginning and later on. I don't have the feeling that these things have been arranged yet. Now, from a French perspective, once again, as we know, Nigeria is not a Francophone country, it's an Anglophone country. So we're into, if you wish, some kind of not only new structure when you have a huge, vast economy which by far dominates all the others, but also, and this is again Paris speaking, the fact that this huge economy in the center of this new system would be, of course, more remote from traditional circuits in which decisions are taken in a very special way between Paris and France-Afrique, African ex-colonies of France.
Very interesting sentiment indeed, gentlemen. Thank you very much for being on the program. That's it for this edition of Talk Africa. As always, a warm thank you to our panel for sharing their thoughts and expertise. Professor Geoff Tokari in Paris, an expert on foreign policy formulation and a professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. Paul Melly in Lisbon, a consulting fellow at the Africa program at Chatham House. And Hans de Marie Hengop is a senior analyst for Central Africa at the International Crisis Group here in Nairobi. Now, what are your thoughts on this subject? We'd love to hear from you. And you can reach us on social media through our Facebook and Twitter handles showing on your screen right now. You can also visit our YouTube playlist and the CGTN Africa website for this and previous episodes of Talk Africa. To keep the conversation going and see you again next week for more on Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall and the team in Nairobi, goodbye.